All right, welcome everyone. Welcome to Marx 713. And welcome Gayatri Chakravorty Spivak. Welcome back to our seminar. It's a great honor and privilege to have you back at the 1313s.
I've missed you.
Oh, well, we've missed you. This time to discuss Marx and Du Bois. Now, before properly introducing you, Gayatri, and turning it over to you first, let me just say a few words to set the stage for our discussion. Last week, at Marx 613, we studied the Communist Manifesto with Nancy Fraser, Cinzia Arruzza, and Tithi Bhattacharya. It was a wide-ranging discussion, as you'll recall, and from my perspective, what I found most enriching was the way in which we were able to juxtapose and contrast the analysis of class conflicts in the manifesto versus the left populism discourse of the 99%. So the differences and the complementarity of Marxist analysis, and by contrast, the language, politics, and strategies that emerged from the Occupy Wall Street movement in the 2010s. In this seminar, Marx 713, we move to the next substantial set of writings of Marx, a set of articles he wrote in 1850 regarding the outbreak and the first 2 years of the French Revolution of 1848. Now, as you'll recall from the introduction to last week's seminar, the Communist Manifesto was printed on the eve of the French Revolution of 1848, which erupted on February 22. And within a couple of days, of course, the uprising brought tumbling down the reign of Louis-Philippe and brought about the proclamation of the Second French Republic. Within a matter of weeks, the revolutionary fervor had spread to Vienna and to the German states. Engels joined the workers on the barricades in Baden, carrying munitions, fighting alongside the armed workers against the Prussian army. And he recounts this, of course, in a set of articles called The Campaign for the German Imperial Constitution when he gets back to Switzerland after the defeat at the Battle of Rinthal. Marx was with Engels at first, but then he sets off to Paris for some meetings on behalf of the German Democrats, and then he begins launching a new radical newspaper, the Neue Rheinische Zeitung. And it's in the midst of this tumultuous period in 1850 that Marx writes and publishes in his new paper a set of articles about the French Revolution and the role of the Parisian workers. Engels will later collect and publish the articles under the title Class Struggles in France, 1848-1850, which is the text we're going to be studying today. Now, the 1850 articles are formative, and they prefigure in many ways the slightly more famous text that would follow, which we'll look at in Marx 813, the 18th Brumaire of Louis Napoleon. Of course, the 18th Brumaire had not yet occurred when he's writing class struggles. These articles collected in Class Struggles really represent a formative contrast and complement to the Communist Manifesto. From the more abstract theoretical work of the Manifesto, which posited more of a binary conflict between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, between the dominating and the dominated class, we encountered in these 1850 articles an extremely nuanced, detailed historical account that dissects the shifting and complicated class alliances and struggles that would lead to the defeat of the Parisian workers and insurgents in June 1844, but in that defeat would lead to the birth of a conscious revolutionary force, the proletariat, which comes on the stage in opposition to the repression of the counter-revolution and becomes, of course, an agent and motor of history. So that's, of course, a central contribution that we'll be discussing, the way in which Marx identifies kind of the win of this June defeat, the way in which the counter-revolution actually effectively crystallizes the workers into a class and gives birth to a revolutionary proletariat self-conscious of its role in history. And it's this idea, right, that the revolution is dead, long live the revolution. This idea that now the proletariat revolution has two bodies, like the two bodies of the king. So today we'll be reading Marx's text in conversation with W.E.B. Du Bois's magisterial book, Black Reconstruction in America, 1860-1880. The fact that these texts both have those dates at the end of it, I think, are telling, is telling, and beautifully juxtaposes them. There, Du Bois explicitly builds on Marx's edifice to create what he called an inductive study of the Marxian theory of the state. And he's interpreting, of course, the social struggles of the Civil War, Reconstruction, and its demise through the lens of Marxian categories. Now, we had the privilege of studying Black Reconstruction in America with you, Gayatri Spivak, a few years ago at Abolition Democracy 1313 on several occasions of those seminars, which were at the height of the COVID-19 pandemic. And there are a few scholars who have worked more productively on the relationship between Marx and Du Bois than you, Gayatri. You dedicated your Du Bois lectures at Harvard to that, and your forthcoming book from those lectures to the Marx-Du Bois conversation. And so it's really an honor to welcome you back to these 13 seminars to discuss these two texts. As you know, Gayatri Chakravorty Spivak is university professor here at Columbia University and a founding member of the Institute of Comparative Literature and Society. She's a preeminent expert on Marx and Du Bois and many others. It feels like we just celebrated, although it feels to me like we just celebrated the 40th anniversary and the 2016 40th anniversary edition of your of grammatology, of Derrida's of grammatology, but I suppose we're due for the 50th anniversary.
50th of the translation.
Yes.
We're going to have one.
We're going to have one?
We're
Good.
going to have a lot of fun.
Excellent, excellent. That was a lot of fun back in 2016, so we'll have another one. Gayatri Spivak is the author of many books, including Can the Subaltern Speak? And it's wonderful to have Rosalind Morris here as well, who you were edited one of the volumes with so many contributions on that text. Other books include A Critique of Postcolonial Reason, Death of a Discipline, and of course there are many more. And at the same time, remarkably, Gayatri Spivak is an activist in rural education and feminist and ecological social movements, and has been active and activist for many decades now on that front. Most importantly, Gayatri Spivak is one of the most generous and engaged public intellectuals in the world today, and one of our best colleagues here, best colleague one could ask for. So with that, Gayatri, welcome back to Marx 713, and take it away.
I'll do my best. Thank you. Now, talk into the mic, right? Is this how?
Yeah.
Okay.
That's
actually
good.
take it
Talk
out.
into the mouth. You might
Yes, that's easier.
Okay.
Okay. Of course, this is a small room, so you can hear me. No problem, yes? In the back? Okay. Now,
Mostly for the recording.
I understand, yes. I understand. There isn't a clock here, is there?
You're doing a great job with that.
With the mic?
Mic.
You know, I have to tell you, I'm wasting time, but I have to tell you, I'm a person who digresses constantly. But, you know, I am out, Bernard was talking about my schools in rural India. I'm constantly asked to give talks on Independence Day, okay, which is 15th August. Like in woods and, you know, like going on the backs of Tatughora, small ponies, etc., etc. And the one thing that, because, you know, they don't really have much experience with mics and so on, the one thing they always tell me, whatever I tell them content-wise, you really know how to use a handheld mic. You know, it's the subaltern speaking. You know, the subaltern has told me I really know how to use a hand-held mic. Now, let's look at the time. Oh, you've put it here. Okay. Well, the Communist Manifesto, you did look at the 1872 introduction, right? Did you?
Yes, we did. We did. Here, try this one.
And you saw that they said that the first parts are altered and should not be read, the parts on the revolution. Okay, that's what Marx and Engels say in the 1872 introduction, the last edition that they brought out. Please disregard all the sections about the revolution, because and this is easily available, okay? And they're really writing very seriously, because they say big business, and they use the words in German for big business has gone so far in the last 25 years, because that one was written in 47 and this is 72, that nothing that we said about making a revolution applies to anything. They are, in their words, is veraltet. They are outdated, they've become old. So we are, and Engels writes, please just remember that this introduction has become so, this manifesto has become so iconic that we are publishing it as such with no changes. But do remember when you read it, this is a historical document, and the parts on making a revolution are wrong. You can't follow those anymore. So,
and just to clarify so everybody understands, we're referring to the preface of the Communist Manifesto.
Yes.
From
yes.
1872.
Right. Yes, the last thing that they wrote.
So that statement about disregarding it is about the Communist
Manifesto, yes.
Theory,
there's nothing
thesis.
about the revolution really here, although he talks constantly. Now, the thing about Marx, Du Bois, and Gramsci is that the only revolution that Marx ever did see failed. The only big general strike that Gramsci ever did see in Turin, the Olivetti strike, failed. And Du Bois' own life was, his own projects were destroyed by Booker T. Washington. Alden Morris is coming to give a lecture here on the 17th of April. He has this book, A Scholar Denied, which is fantastic. You should all come to hear him. How Du Bois's project for creating a full database for the African American life in the fullest sense of the term. He was a sociologist, and he, in fact, almost invented sociology, right, in the Philadelphia Negro, 1899. So he was so, and with the Reconstruction, what did he see? The 1877 Compromise, Rutherford Hayes, another president who was elected only by the Electoral College and not by popular vote, and he made this arrangement with the Southern Democrats that he would let the Reconstruction go. So these are all failures. And from these failures, these extraordinary brothers, they really learned lessons. This is, now, Marx never writes about the content of revolutions, except the one that he saw. He was 18 he was 30 in 1848, right? He was born in 1818. So therefore, that's the only one he saw. So for that, he writes an analysis of content. Otherwise, it's all form, value form. When he's talking to the working class, who is his implied reader, all he says is form, form. Learn, he says to his readers, not to focus too much on your private sufferings, although he can't let go of it, so he comes back and apologizes constantly. That's the structure of the first part of Capital One. But learn to ignore your private suffering. Learn, in other words, what we would call quantifying. Learn to see labor power rather than labor, which is just like a formless, subjectless stream. That's what the capitalist borrows. This is so, to an extent, this idea of the no content, form, the value theory of labor, that's form. Value is contentless, inhaltlos und einfach. So content we get only in the discussions of the 1848 and its subsequent and as Bernard says, the 18 Brumaire had not yet happened in the 18 Brumaire. Now, the Communist Manifesto, you remember, it was just a bunch of people whom they had brought together. If you look at their own correspondence, etc., you'll see they brought it together and they used the word communist because socialist was being used too much by people with whom Marx did not have that much sympathy. Why have they left? Why are they leaving?
We have an overflow room.
Oh, you haven't. You see, I'm a very insecure person intellectually because, you know, I'm a woman and used to be quite good looking when I was young. And I was always told that, oh, Gayatri, she isn't really intellectual. She's good looking. That's why the professors give her good grades. The really brilliant person is Shurajit Sen, okay, who was a guy who was in the same class. So, those kinds of things, you don't lose them. You don't lose them. I'm 83 years old, so I'm really talking about a long time back. My parents were very, very supportive. They were proto-feminists. The boy and the girls were brought up the same way. But once I entered a coeducational college, it was just totally destructive of my self-confidence. So people leaving, I always think, ish, I'm not doing good. I'm talking too much about myself.
It's the contrary. We've got fire marshal problems because there's so many people here. So we have to put some people in overflow.
This is why I like this guy. Okay. So anyway, so Marx then talks, this is very hard. People don't, especially the romantic anti-capitalists in the United States have made it all about living labor, dead labor, and so on. Not that that's absent in the early Marx. Marx is a guy full of sympathy and so on. But in fact, the counterintuitive request is to ignore the living labor guy, make it all into that stream of dead labor, which is labor power, which is what quantified. I mean, we should know, it's data. Which is what the capitalist borrows and then doesn't return fully, the theft of surplus value. So therefore, it's that formal lesson that is absolutely central. And the content, as I say, he wrote about the one revolution, that the revolution and all of the failure of the revolution. That's what, after 1871, see, 1872, that introduction, you really have to think it through in terms of a life. The trouble with reading Marx is quite often that it's just Marx. Capital M. Marx said, one of our very dear friends, whom I will not mention because she's too well known, has actually looked at something Marx wrote when he was 25 to 26 years old about critique and says that this is Marx's view of critique. No. So you see, we really have to look at this guy. In fact, he changed so much that Balibar, using a Maoist word, rectify, Balibar says that Marx rectified himself so much that he cannot be followed as a guide, okay? Our feeling, we who actually work from the humanities beyond the disciplines, because the humanities teach the practice of learning, not just being able to summarize. control summarize, this happened then, this happened then, this happened then, this happened then, and now Marx is ready to do this. That's not the way the humanities approach this. Our way of reading is activist reading, so that you really have to enter into the fact that this damn thing is changing. And the biggest lesson is learning from mistakes. And I have already told you that these three guys, the Gramsci, Du Bois, and Marx, they show us how much they learn from the great problems and failures that they had confronted in their lives. Now, Du Bois says that now what is Marx's idea of how we should, because each of these texts also tells us how we should read them. That's another humanities approach. There is, if you'll see on page 67 of the translation, International Workers, the international publishers, there is a passage where just, these people don't tell us, although in the case of the Communist Manifesto, they certainly did. These people don't openly tell us, hey, read like this. You have to, the humanities reading actually knows that that's the way to read, okay? So Marx is talking about Cavaignac, and he's saying, he concealed under the stern features of old Republican resignation, humdrum submission to the humiliating conditions of his bourgeois office. He concealed. So what he idealized, the old election cry of the Third Estate, as in general the Constituent Assembly did, by translating it into political speech. Translating it into political speech. The bourgeoisie has no king. The true form of its rule is the republic. Now, whatever the content of this might be, this, I would suggest, is a way of reading which Marx's implied reader should read this way. Translate it into political speech. And by political, not everybody means the same thing. But at this point in time, Marx and Engels mean class. Du Bois racializes class. Du Bois shows very powerfully how, in fact, class is racialized, and Du Bois uses a magnificent word for it, caste. So that Du Bois always is looking at race caste, and so a class caste, and his understanding of caste is not the Hindu understanding of caste. But what he does, and this is another point that I want to make for you, I think I've taken up half an hour already. 12 minutes? Okay. So, so what I would like to tell you is my idea, which I believe is implicit in the humanities way of active reading, which is epistemological performance. You change the way you think, and you change the way you think about yourself, and you change the way you think about how you know what you know. Because the humanities way of reading is not production of knowledge. It's learning the practice of reading. The humanities have no knowledge content. So therefore, you can't have no knowledge content, but you know what I mean. But so therefore, in this particular area, what we look at is you take a topic. This has also been called deconstruction. Remember, I'm a vulgarizer, so whatever I say about how you can do deconstruction, etc., ignore it until you have actually read the deconstructive texts carefully and formed your own opinion. Don't take my word for it. But I think my strength is that I can vulgarize. So, but as long as you know that that's all I'm capable of, good vulgarization, nice, adequate, affirmative sabotage, etc., good, but vulgar, not as delicate, and I can't philosophize. So just keep that in mind, okay? Don't just take what I'm saying. Take this as like the drama of the moment. That's the humanities way of reading. Okay, so what is happening here then, what we say, you take a topic and you run with it as in a relay. You take it somewhere else. It's called other big words, destinance, etc., but this is our idea of activist reading. And so Du Bois is a wonderful example of that. And Du Bois it takes this idea of class and caste from the Hindus and changes caste completely in terms of an instrument of ignoring class consciousness. Caste allows you not to think class. This is his, and so Margaret Wilkerson's book is not good because she really doesn't know anything about caste, and she decides that the whites are the Brahmins and all the colored folks are the Dalits. Hey, what about the horrible people like ourselves in India who happen to be, here is a Chaudhary, and actually, you know, and here's and Abha, Anuradha, etc. How about us caste Hindus? I'm an atheist, but nonetheless, born a caste Hindu, historical responsibility. All of that is completely ignored if you do what Margaret Wilkerson does. But with Du Bois, you learn something extra, which is caste as a way of ignoring class, because that also happens, that can happen within the original idea. So this is this way of reading. This is what Du Bois is doing. He's changing it. And so how does he change general strike? Now remember, Du Bois says in his autobiography that he was what? Okay, all right, yeah. So, you know, one could make such a drama out of this, but, but no, control yourself. Anyway, so, but Du Bois, what the hell was I saying? You know?
You were talking about caste and the way in which Du Bois...
General strike, that's what I was saying. Du Bois, because he hit me exactly at the moment when I was making a change. This is not a senior moment. Senior moments do happen to me, but this is not one of them. This one is really living. But at any rate, Du Bois takes the idea of general strike and changes it, right? So what he does is he takes these people, and that's why I wanted you to read that passage. What was the first page number?
It was 121?
No, 121 is something else. 121 is something else. 63, could it be? Is 63 in general strike?
Yeah.
63, okay. So this contraband of war, on May 26th, only 2 days after the one slave appeared before Butler, 8 Negroes appeared. On the next day, 47 of all ages and both sexes. Each day they continued to come by 20s, 30s, and 40s, until by July 30th, the number had reached 900. In a very short while, the number ran up into the thousands. And in December 1861, the Secretary of the Treasury had written, printed, and put into the mails his first report as Secretary of War without consultation with the President. This report was recalled by the President by telegraph. Persons held by rebels under such laws to service as slaves may, however, be justly liberated from their constraint and made more valuable in various employments through voluntary and compensated service than if confiscated as subjects of property. So this is already a change in the mode of production, right? From this remark by the government, the mode of production the slave mode of production is being changed here into what is called, in that code, free labor. And then what do? They earn the right into humanity by killing people, because they become very good soldiers. And Du Bois, the pacifist, he makes that remark. Is that, and you know, I talk often at Ukraine, in Ukraine, and I looked into in Ukraine there is prejudice against one kind of so-called Tatars, against the Roma, etc. And I looked to see if they were gaining equality with the regular Euro-Ukrainians by becoming soldiers. Yes, sir. And so Du Bois's remark that you claim humanity by killing people and being killed yourself so that they could become equal, this is something which is good even today. And in Ukraine, this is very, very much the case. And anyway, and it's not just Ukraine. It's you can see this in all prejudiced and caste-ridden and class-ridden societies. But anyway, so Du Bois, therefore, did not look. You see, they're coming. First of all, they're illiterate. Second of all, although there is very good systems, a very good system of communication that is somewhat in a racist way called bush telephone, nonetheless, there's no proper way of communication here. But yet they come, they unite, they stage a change in the mode of production. That's the real application of Marx in a relay, because it doesn't look like a general strike. So because if we just take the general strike from the point of view of the Eurocentric Marxist narrative, this won't look like a general strike. And as you know, Du Bois's Marxist friends and enemies criticized him and tried to correct him. But he rewrote it in this way, and and I take great pride in the fact that an African-American critic wrote about this, saying it is really a shame that the only person who recognized that by the idea of general strike, Du Bois was, because I'm not African origin, see, except all of us are African origin a million years ago, but otherwise I'm not. Therefore, it is a shame that it was I who said it, that she realized that by rewriting Marx's notion of a general strike, Du Bois was showing and theorizing how, in fact, the slaves themselves self-determined their liberation. And so this is not just some kind of romantic lie that you kind of pretend that they did it themselves. No, Du Bois is actually putting it there theoretically. You know, he is in fact taking a relay from the Marxist notion of the general strike, which, you know, is very different from Rosa Luxemburg, let's say, whom I adore, but nonetheless, it's very, very different from that. So it's good to look at it, because quite often these days, as we romanticize indigenous ways of looking at nature, we pretend that they're not throwing plastic all over the place. Because we say, oh, it'll show that I'm a racist. No, you have to earn the right to be able to enter that project, those indigenous systems, and earn the right to be taken seriously if you critique as an equal. It's a very hard thing to do, believe me. But nonetheless, that is not what Du Bois is doing. Du Bois is very aware that his caste is different. If he's even aware that the triad, Booker T. Washington, Frederick Douglass, W.E.B. Du Bois was the only one who did not experience slavery. Almost everything he writes begins with an apology. Du Bois is extremely, he has no model. He cannot write an autobiography saying up from slavery. No. He has to earn the right to be, that's Booker T. Washington's thing, right? He can't write a narrative of his life. So this is something that you notice most especially in the beginning of The Dusk of Dawn. But what an apology it is. Through the apology, then Du Bois begins to make these kinds of real changeful things for us. So, but when Du Bois describes in his autobiography his time in Tennessee, he says that I wanted to touch the shadow of slavery, right? He was not, when he first, at 17 years of age, comes to Fisk, he begins to say, now I begin to feel that I'm a Negro. Negro, of course, is the word that is current for that whole generation. So that's the word I will be using as historically appropriate, okay? So I began to realize that I was a Negro when he's 17 years old. Before that, of course, he knew something about racialization, the question with his female fellow students, white girl, etc. But he doesn't make too much of it. You know, he doesn't make too much of it. He's the best boy in class. But so it's, therefore, and then, therefore, to touch the shadow of enslavement, which, of course, for him is still slavery, he goes to those, for 2 summers, to those, to a very remote rural area in Tennessee. And in both of those places, what he realizes is that he's the caste difference. The caste difference. And nobody actually denies it. He's extremely polite, very positive. He enters the community, but not the caste difference cannot be broken. So therefore, Du Bois does not ignore the fact that these contraband slaves will not look like a Marxian subject of the general strike. That's why I wanted you to look at 121. Hardly anybody writes about this. Oh, sorry. 121, where am I? Yes. Hardly anybody writes about this chapter, the coming of the Lord. Now, why does he have this chapter? He has this chapter because, as many have argued, and this particular argument in terms of black Christianity, I get from my brother, Abiola Irele. Abiola told me that the reason why they went into Christianity was because they needed a teleological story. Whereas, of course, the great African animisms are ecological. They don't have a telos. But in order for them to stage redemption, freedom, the teleological story, they took it and they transformed it. But that's why. And another point that needs to be made here, many Marxist critics, including Ranajit Guha, and certainly in many ways, Ambedkar was not a Marxist, but I mean, he knew Marx, but he put him next, second to Buddhism, etc. I'm not going there. But Ambedkar also believed this, and if he had lived longer, he would have written about it, that for the subaltern, I always use Gramsci's little formula, the small social groups in the margins of history. Small social groups in the margins of history. That's a subaltern. When you make these historical generalizations, their point of view doesn't come in. No one knows their point of view. So therefore, the idea of taking this, taking the subaltern and thinking of a public sphere, because the one thing that the subaltern doesn't have is, among the many things, is access to the public sphere. No access to any kind of social mobility, citizenship, etc. But the subaltern is not dumb, believe me. So what does the subaltern do? The subaltern brings religion into crisis. Religion for the subaltern is not just orthodoxy, prejudice, etc. It can be that also, unfortunately. It can be mobilized into violence. But for the subaltern, the access to religion is access to a public sphere. A public sphere not and they bring it to crisis. And so that's what Du Bois is looking at in terms of the coming of the Lord, because he knows that he is not the subject of enslavement and liberation. And because he's very aware of class, that's the main thing. He knows. And in his autobiography, he writes that he didn't really know much about Marx until by the time the teens of the 20th century, he's beginning to read already. When he writes The Negro, 1915, he's backwards into Marx. But the reading, capital 1, not capital 2, and not even capital 3. I've looked at his copies, no Marx at all in 2 and 3, but lots of Marx in 1. So therefore, when Du Bois is looking at this whole situation of class and caste, he is very aware that the real subject of the liberation accessed the public sphere as the Christological story. It was not just religion. And that's why he says, and this is where Du Bois is not just a sociologist, he's also humanities person. We begin to see it in Souls of Black Folk the first time, because before that, all that he wrote, published, was like sociology. And so his editor said to him, why don't you write some more essays so that you can talk to the normal African American, and because you don't have anything except that Philadelphia Negro, it's too sociological, or the story of black slave trade, his dissertation, which was published, too historical. You must write something like a human being. And so that's how, putting all kinds of essays together, Souls of Black Folk came into being. But at any rate, so here, this is here, Du Bois is very human. What is he saying? Can we imagine this spectacular revolution? It's not enough to summarize it. It's not enough to say that it happened in 1865 or something happened in 1862. It's not enough to have those dates, and South Carolina was the first to secede. It's not enough to tell the story. It's enough to be, it is required that we be able to imagine the subject. Can we imagine this spectacular revolution? Not, of course, unless we think of these people as human beings like ourselves, not that we are human beings like them. That is easily said by any NGO activist, but the other way is hard. The other way is hard, as they're sitting under the trees. They are like me. This is hard. Not unless we think of these people as human beings like ourselves, not unless assuming, it's not correct, but the ethical must make a mistake. The ethical is not reasonable. So, because we are not all the same. Assuming this common humanity, we conceive ourselves in a position where we are chattels and real estate. and then suddenly in a night become, quote, thenceforward and forever free, unquote. The real estate thing, of course, here, sitting at Columbia, given what Columbia is now, we could also take a relay here and take it elsewhere, into the university, as it were. So, but nonetheless, that's what he says. And then he says, on the next page, he says, if Jesus Christ came down today, we would not be able. So he, in fact, says, I am not they. I am not. See, this is so much of a problem for us because we never, analytic philosophy, for sure, that is a humanities thing, but it ignores its being in the humanities by completely ignoring, considering the subject who philosophizes as also historical, as part of the analysis. No, they're able to talk about anything. So in the same way, Du Bois, not in the same way, exactly in the opposite way, is saying that if on some day, suppose on some great day, as you plod down Wall Street, you should see God sitting on the Treasury steps in his glory with the thunders curved about him. Suppose on Michigan Avenue, between the lakes and hills of stone, and in the midst of hastening automobiles and jostling crowds, suddenly you see living and walking toward you the Christ with sorrow and sunshine in his face. Foolish talk. All of this you say, of course, and that is because no American now believes in his religion. Nor did, Du Bois didn't either, believes in his religion. Its facts are mere symbolism. Its revelation, vague generalities. Its ethics, a matter of carefully balanced gain. But to most of the 4 million black folk emancipated by civil war, God was real. They knew him. They had met him personally in many a wild orgy of religious frenzy or in the black stillness of the night. His plan for them was clear. They were to suffer and be degraded, and then afterwards, by divine edict, raised to manhood and power. And so on January 1, 1863, he made them free. It was all foolish, bizarre, and tawdry. Gangs of dirty Negroes howling and dancing. A great human sob shrieked in the wind and tossed its tears upon the sea. Free, free, free. But he is, and you see, in Class Struggle, Marx says the same thing. Marx gives, I forget what page it is, Marx gives a list of the ideologues. I think it's right in the beginning somewhere. Yes, 34. Come on, 34. See. There. See, so he's talking about the real industrial bourgeoisie. First, the finance aristocracy. Finance aristocracy are the real enemies. And finance aristocracy, we should know. I mean, Hilferding supposedly talked about finance capital first, but actually there's a lot of it in Marx, also in the civil wars in France. There was, in other words, capital working just with negotiable instruments and not with trade. So it can, and it becomes more, here in the United States, it got a full liberty from 1978, Reagan, Bush, they were undoing the New Deal, right? But when in 2006, I think, they actually cancelled the Glass-Steagall. That is to say, they made commercial banks and investment banks, about which Marx and Engels talk here. Commercial banks and investment banks, they put them together. That was when it was possible for finance capital to go crazy, and especially, and with digitization, of course, so that the more you borrow, the more capital increases. So there were, in fact, unsecured loans, after that, unsecured loans, all kinds of things. And where did they hit the people? They hit the people in the values. value in the non-Marxist sense, family values, housing. Because housing is the one place where the individual releases the largest amount of capital into the circuit of capital. That's the one that you have to get. Marx talks about foreclosures also here in the, but so the finance aristocracy are the real enemies because they're not working with the working class. The working class, which is one of the reasons why labor is not the agent of change for us anymore, hasn't been for some time. We are for them, but we can't look upon them. They are not going to save the human race. And mind you, there are other reasons too, but I can't go in there. I'm not teaching myself, I'm teaching Marx. So therefore, finance, and after that, the real industrial bourgeoisie, that is to say, the ones who run factories. Okay, then then of course there's the working class and so on. The petty bourgeoisie then of all degrees, shopkeepers, and the peasantry also were completely excluded from political power. Finally, and he describes us. And with that one description, he makes it clear that we can't do anything with this class struggle. I hope we can, but we would have to bring this text to crisis by ourselves in order to do so. Just by preaching to the choir, like in this room, you are not going to do anything. That's why I like your idea of cooperation, because that's what Du Bois also wants. Again and again, in The Dusk of Dawn, he says, the African American community is not, and especially in the United States, it's not going to become communist. About communism also he had problems, because he understood these things. Epistemologically, he found in both China and Russia a problem of how they were educating the minds of the people, etc. But they should be cooperative again and again and again. And I would very much like to think about the cooperative university. And today we really have to think about it. Nobody, I mean, a guy in academe, big, real self-promoter, I am going to talk about, not a word did he say about the cooperative university. So just quoted Du Bois saying that everyone should be cooperative. But this is, mind you, cooperatives have had real problems in places like Tanzania, etc., you know, from where they get the Kwanzaa stuff. So one would have to run somewhere. But nonetheless, he's not talking here about, Marx is talking here about people like Du Bois who can't touch the subject of enslavement and emancipation. That's why I wanted you to read that passage. And there's that all over the place. And at this end, like Gramsci also, Gramsci knew that he was an ideologue. He had to produce the subaltern intellectual. I can't go there. So, but therefore, here he describes them in this way. Finally, in the official opposition, or entirely outside the pays légal, the legal country, there were the ideological representatives, ourselves, the ideological representatives and spokesmen of the above classes. They're savants, lawyers, doctors, etc. In a word, they're so-called Kapazitäten. Now, this translates it as talents, and later this Kapazitäten translates it as talents, and another earlier translation translates it, saying I'm the better translation, translates it as authorities. But I think Kapazitäten is a word that you can see what word it is, so you keep that in your head, okay? You know all about capacities and capabilities and Martha Nussbaum and so on and so forth. So to an extent, you can run with your relay with this passage where the ideologues are kept as talkers, and they're not bad, but they are not the ones. They're right outside of the pays légal. Marx has this kind of self-sense, he's not an exclusivist. Marx can do everything. You remember, it came to a real head in the letters to Vera Zasulich. But Marx was able to say, I don't know. And so that's why he's so useful. That's why the fact that he rectifies himself constantly and learns from mistakes is useful for practice, is useful even so. Okay, in these places, in this class struggle, they don't even say anything about revolution in terms of armed struggle, etc. This is something that they'll change from. Vote is very important here. And Engels' 1895 introduction, it is so important, vote is so important, that he says that the main task is to get as many seats as possible. This is not the Marx that we will hear, even in the 18 Brumaire. So this idea that of the importance of universal suffrage, they're talking about universal suffrage and how it's a good idea, but this idea is not their idea later. Engels goes a different way, and so well after Marx's death in 95, he can really talk like we would. It's really totally about voting blocks, which of course, if one goes to a robust idea of democracy, as they didn't really, it was still a kind of arithmetic idea of democracy, campaigning like ours, campaigning and body count, how many? This idea is not the idea with which we think democracy these days, when we are allowed to think it. But so therefore, we have to keep, but in the 18 Brumaire, it's already changed. In the 18 Brumaire, because the 18 Brumaire has happened, this one is about how the executive is trying to hold on to power. Sound familiar? How the executive tries to hold on to power, but unfortunately, Louis Napoleon does not succeed because he's not legitimate, or he's not the Orleanist. He's not one of those two, right? He's not the royalists. The royal will sublate into democracy. Marx still thinks here at the end. But he does, and he also thinks that this is a very important insight, that phenomenologically, why do I use this word? Because I gave you Global Marx question mark to read, and I would suggest that Marx was haunted by Hegel. Hauntology, it's a big word for us. I'm not going to go there. But therefore the question of whether he was Hegelian or not is not the issue. The issue is that he wanted, at the same time, he was not a Hegelian, because Hegel was only phenomenology of the mind, and he would write a phenomenology of capital. In other words, the later phenomenologists, like Husserl, for example, they knew that you could not know anything except in the form of someone is knowing something. I mean, Husserl's idea of Sinne is that its content is always noematic. It's a noema. Someone is knowing something. It's not an idea. So it's a sense, right? It's not a Bedeutung. It's a Sinne. Now, it is the sense of, and that's what Marx is doing here also. Every place, universal suffrage means something else. It means something else for the bourgeois Republicans. It means something else for the February 48 working class revolutionaries. It means something else for, on the one hand, Le Rollin, who can make compromises even though so powerful, and something else for Bois. So in other words, the way you have to become Marx's implied reader is know all this gossip. If you do not know what the hell Bois was doing on Thursday, and then he changed his mind on Monday, then you won't really get this phenomenological approach to revolution as gossip. I mean, it's one after the other. It's a lot like Du Bois. Du Bois also is constantly quoting and saying, this person, so you have to know this stuff. I mean, remember what I said about vulgarizing deconstruction? You have to be able to enter this as if you are a subject. That's the humanities activist approach. As if you are part of this play. If you just skim it and summarize it and bring out the main points, you will have done nothing. You will have been one of those Kapazität people, right? That you summarize. This is what Marx meant. What will I do with it? So somebody will correct me tomorrow. But this one can't be corrected. It can be neither, it can be changed, it can be picked up, but you don't correct this one. This way of the practice of learning. In the 18 Brumaire, his devotion to the vote is gone. It's gone. Because in the 18 Brumaire has already happened. And what does he say about he adores the proletarian as subject here. There is a little bit of romanticization here. But what does he do in the 18 Brumaire? In the 18 Brumaire, he actually shows the proletarian to be a liar. The typical proletarian is a liar. You have read it by now, so you know that the one fantastic paragraph where he is describing the proletarian revolution of the 19th century. He says the proletarian, and he goes to that story by Aesop, that the proletarian makes a false claim that I can jump over that Colossus of Rhodes gap in Rhodes, right? That's what the proletarian says. And so what does the external imperatives, that's why these slaves in Du Bois, I'm putting the two together as much as I can, the slaves in Du Bois could do this, although they were not organized like a Marxian group of free laborers, because and this is Rosa Luxemburg's idea of spontaneity, because the imperative comes and comes and comes and comes and gathers and gathers and gathers. It's like the Bois burning himself, and people immediately knew this spring stuff, Arab Spring, the spring stuff comes from Marx's, this class struggle in France. There was a spring of that sort. So that the Arab Spring is a second time. But at any rate, so it builds and builds and builds and builds so that externally an imperative is created. That's called spontaneity. It's not psychological spontaneity, but that's the way in which the people, the proletarian is pushed to make a false claim. And they will die, they will fall down and be beaten down into the ground and rise again. That's how 18 Brumaire, that chapter, that paragraph, fantastic paragraph. And then, so he uses the Aesop story. So, and of course, rewrites it both as Hegel does, and then he changes it. The person in Aesop says, hic Rhodus, hic saltus. This is Rhodes, this is the rose, right? That's the common noun. Hic Rhodus, this is Rhodes. Jump here, hic saltus. And Marx changes it to hic salta, makes it an imperative. And here is the rose, that's Hegel. And then Marx puts for saltus or salta, he puts dance, tanze here. So that's the model. For the 19th century revolution, Marx's models are methodological, and we have to learn to understand that these are methods, and only through the humanities will you know. Dance, and then right at the beginning, first time is tragedy, second time is farce. And so, and then he says, where will the proletarian revolution of the 19th century get its content? And you all know the answer. It's a fantastic answer. From the poetry of the future. These are not just words. These are not just words. This is a very important, these are not just metaphors. This is a very important passage. And unless you understand it, you will follow it like a blueprint, and you will have totalitarianisms as in Russia, or a hardly disguised capitalism without the so-called freedoms associated, so-called, with capitalism as in China. This is what will happen. It will, if you take this material, where the content comes from the poetry of the future, and this, if you take this material and learn it like that, a formula to be followed, zero. You will go towards totalitarianism. And we, feminists in the humanities, also say that a mistake was made even by people like Marx, because this is Gramsci understood this, that they did not understand that just by giving the means of production, although Marx did know this, the Gotha program, which you folks have read, certainly show it to us. Marx knew in normal life, but as he's writing, just by ownership of the means of production, socialism will not be produced. And Du Bois has this problem also. Du Bois is talking about the cooperative. And he says, I don't think I gave you that page. If the Negroes, the African Americans, in fact follow the cooperative method, then all the socialist changes will happen. Socialist changes don't happen. Socialist changes require this kind of persistent epistemological attempt. Otherwise, our general human affects are violence, fear, and greed. So socialism will not happen by itself. So this humanities style, practice of learning style education will not make you ethical, but might, in fact, make you respond if the ethical reflex comes your way. So other democracy has other people, in other words. So therefore, that's what you see here. And I'll just say two more things and then I'll shut up. I asked you to look at the South Carolina chapter, okay? And I asked you to look at the first paragraph. And South Carolina, Du Bois did not think Harlem was a reflection of the African American. He felt that Harlem was a sublation of them, and the real African American, you know, the ones that he couldn't catch, the caste, the low caste, the subaltern, was the South. And Du Bois's South, if I had had the time, I would have also given you a picture of that. Du Bois's South went also to eastward, okay? There was Haiti, there was Cuba, there was, so that, you know, you have the Carolinas, and, you know, not North and South, Carolinas, really, if you're thinking about, and then Louisiana comes in, but then you have Texas, Georgia, Alabama, but you don't go much further, it's East Texas. You don't go much further west. And all of this then also has lines toward that part of the Caribbean. And you know, Jack D. Forbes has called, as a half a joke, all of the United States the Greater Caribbean, right? I mean, it's a bold thing to say, but at any rate, so in that sense, that's in the Black Flame trilogy. In that sense, Du Bois thinks that South Carolina is the place which really could carry this weight of the South. And that's when you looked at those pictures?
We have them over here.
Okay. Just a, huh? This is okay. This and the next one. See these and the next one, because that one is not in this picture. Next one. Daddy Kane. But the thing is, these were, before everything was ruined by racism, these were, this one and the previous one, the black senators in South Carolina. And they were, in fact, making legal changes which made Du Bois describe South Carolina as, and you can show the previous one too, Ricardo. Is this Ricardo? No. Okay, yes. So all of these people and that other one, okay, Daddy Kane. Why he's not in this picture, I don't know. Now these characters, they made laws where the subject of the law's benefits would be the working class. And that is the meaning of dictatorship for 18th century Marxists. You should really, if you want to, not just for Marxists, but for, well, Marx wasn't there in it, but I mean, people interested in social justice. You should look at the chapter, volume 2 of Hal Draper. Hal Draper, D-R-A-P-E-R. He was a wonderful, wonderful guy who was finally disappointed with the Black Panthers. He was a member, and he went off, and then he began writing. And what he wrote was document-ridden stuff about Marxism. And he has a fantastic collection of examples and a discussion of this meaning of dictatorship, which we still, in fact, use without using the word dictatorship. Dictatorship did not mean a dictator, one dictator up top there. Dictatorship meant, in this meaning, all of the moves are dictated by the subject of this class or this gender or this something. There are people in the development lobby at the UN today, Amina Mohammed of Somalia, and another one, Jocelyn something from Mexico, whose name unfortunately I'm forgetting. Both of them constantly say, when we do policy within development, we should not think about the market, not the dictatorship of capitalism, dictatorship of the market, but we should think about the needs of the people we are supposedly developing, dictatorship of the subaltern, because those are not the proletariat. So the ones who are getting developed. So in that sense, where is the page? 381. And there's correspondence. Yes, the black proletariat in South Carolina, okay? So there is an epistemic discussion on the first page, but I'm not going to see. The whole history of Reconstruction has, with few exceptions, been written by passionate believers in the inferiority of the Negro. The whole body of facts concerning what the Negro actually said and did, how he worked, what he wanted, for whom he voted, is masked in such a cloud of charges, etc. Then the footnote. The record of the Negro worker during Reconstruction presents an opportunity to study inductively the Marxian theory of the state. I first called this chapter The Dictatorship of the Black Proletariat in South Carolina, but it has been brought to my attention that this would not be correct, since universal suffrage does not lead to a real dictatorship until workers use their votes consciously to rid themselves of the dominion of private capital. Here is Marx's class struggle, right? Mm-hmm. And so they're talking about universal suffrage, Du Bois's. There were signs of such an object among South Carolina Negroes, but it was always coupled with the idea of that day, that the only real escape for a laborer was himself to own capital. Okay, but this idea of the dictatorship of the proletariat in South Carolina, I wanted you to read this because there's a much longer essay in Joseph Wedemar's journal, which came out of New York, where this Marx actually talks about this to Joseph Wedemeyer. But you should keep this in mind, that the idea was that there was, that's why I showed all those pictures, the dictatorship of the proletariat. There you have them, the senators and congressmen who made the laws so that they would reflect the needs of the working class. So representation, Vertretung as representation, not Darstellung. The representation would mean that they were actually following the dictates of the proletariat, as it were. So there's that there, and I wanted you to see and that's what you should do. That's why I said that when I'm saying these things, you should not take me for anything, because after all, I'm from an 86% genocidal majority in supposedly the world's largest democracy, which has become a theocracy. Because of, so I belong to that class and that caste. So to an extent, although I personally have no responsibility for all of this, I have a historical responsibility. I've had many historical advantages so that I can sit here and talk to you. So therefore, you know, that's how one should read criticism, everything, including Marx. So therefore, when you come to the end of this book, read it very carefully and see how bibliography. Okay, page 731. Okay, these authors believe the Negro to be subhuman and congenitally unfitted for citizenship and the suffrage. Then next, propaganda. These authors select and use facts and opinions in order to prove that the South was right in Reconstruction, the North vengeful or deceived, and the Negro stupid. Historians, fair to indifferent on the Negro. Historians, these historians have studied the history of Negroes and write sympathetically about them. Monographs. Monographs are actually dissertations. He was reading dissertations. These authors took the facts in certain narrow, definite fields, and in most cases do not ignore the truth as to Negroes, and so on. Lives. These are lives of leaders who took part in Reconstruction and whose acts and thoughts influenced Negro development. Answers. These are the answers of certain carpetbaggers and scalawags to their traducers. See, this is the bibliography. Negro historians, etc., etc. Some judicial, some eager, and even bitter in defense. These are the standard works of Negro historians. And then he comes. So this is also something that you should learn from, okay, then unpublished theses, government reports, other reports. So this is something, I mean, when we read criticism, I find that my students are almost incapable of using criticism for any reason but give a quote to support their arguments. But that's not what you do with criticism. You read criticism also as if it's creatively written. Criticism, good criticism is creative. And read it in terms of, and so Du Bois already is giving you some clues here as to how to read. So there's so much more to say about Du Bois. I just want you to look at those 2 pages and then we'll be done. Okay? Cooperation, you know, I want to work with Bernard on, he likes working with, I don't know how you bear my disorganized fulminations, but nonetheless, since you do, we should work on cooperation, especially cooperative university. But this here, 18 and 19, just take a quick look. This is the first, you see, he ended his life by writing fiction. And his autobiography is the autobiography of a disappointed man, because what he had wanted to do, he couldn't do. But at the same time, fiction gives you the experience of the impossible. to quote Freud. So he goes into fiction at the same time, and the fiction just allows him to do what he was not allowed to do in private life. So 18 and 19, right? Okay, now he is here in, is this it? No. Here what he does is he writes a novel where the subaltern, in fact, the subaltern intellectual is produced. That Tom Mansart, he is lynched, right? He can't speak proper English, etc., and he's lynched because he was trying to save a white woman who had come out of an ignorant sympathy, not thinking about the fact that she was putting him into a great deal of trouble. When he's trying to save the white woman, because here's a black guy almost touching a white woman, he is lynched by tens of scores of rifles, destroying his body completely. But before that, what he manages to do, subaltern, okay, with no access to anything. This is about the subaltern intellectual. What he manages to do is go to, is become, through his work, become a member of the legislature. And the legislature is a torn and worn old building, but to him, it's like a palace. And so, what's happening is, he is looking, okay, Tom ran for the legislature. Them and the black worker can save Carolina. This is his aunt speaking. So Tom ran for the legislature and won. In the same election that made Chamberlain governor in a struggle for, quote, reform, Tom would never forget the day he walked into the great hall of the House of Representatives in the capital of the state of South Carolina. It was, in fact, a place of decayed grandeur, restored in garish, flamboyant style. But to this Virginia field hand, it was magnificent to a degree that left him breathless. The great domed roof, glinting with gold, the rich paneled walls with paintings, see, phenomenological view, paintings of proud and haughty men, the semicircles of desks, and in them sitting, lounging, sprawling men, but not simply men, but over 100 men of every color, black, brown, yellow, cream, and white. He stared at the unbelievable scene. Of course, he had heard of this, but it had not penetrated his consciousness. All these human beings were sitting together as one. Of course, he's wrong. He's going to be lynched soon. But this is the vision of the subaltern intellectual as he's looking at those people that I just told you about. And these black leaders, they felt that they could unite in a successful group. The real world, as Tom had always seen it, was of course that of the big plantation owners. But now what intrigued Mansart most was their self-control, the calm way in which they looked at the world and ordered it about. He was not sure whether this was mannerism or a real sense of power. He suspected something of both. At any rate, they had a custom of command. They expected obedience of everybody, of their families, of the poor whites about, and of course of their slaves. So to an extent, what he is noticing is how the black congressmen and senators are creating these kinds of laws and moving into a world where this, I mean, I can't read more so you don't, moving into a world where this attitude toward slaves cannot be kept up. You know, equality, now as to whether this is actually factually correct is not the problem here. How does Du Bois tell us how to read it is the solution here. I've talked about these as epic novels etc., etc. But this is a very interesting and a very important kind of thing to take into account, that whether Du Bois was able to do anything with his Marxism because he was stopped at every turn, and he was also, of course, a victim of McCarthyism. And when he went to Ghana, he saw immediately that he was completely separated from, and he also saw that he did not know any African languages. But this was an unbelievable person. The day he died, when the nurse told Maya Angelou, who had gone, a lot of African Americans had gone with Du Bois, right? And Angelou was working with the TV, and the nurse told Maya Angelou, Dr. Du Bois is going to die. He's about to die. So Angelou wrote back saying, he cannot die. We need him. There's no way that he can die now. So, and it was, remember the day that Martin Luther King is giving his talk in incredible drama there in Washington. So, so then Du Bois says to the nurse, when the nurse brings him this message, I cannot learn anything anymore. It's time for me to go. 95 years of age. So that's self-rectification. Self-rectification, as in Marx. Learning from mistakes, learning. So that to an extent, this is what one looks at in terms of bringing the two together. But the real question is that we should see that we translate whatever we think of individually, because we're in the United States, we are constantly talking about our individual problems. Whatever we are really, I mean, you know, we make money giving talks about our individual problems and our origins and this and that. But whatever, whenever one feels this way, to translate it politically into these broader categories. It is in the reading that you try to get into the other's space. In the reading, you try to leave yourself as much behind as, and try to become like the implied reader. You know, Toni Morrison talks about the implied reader as every book has a reader made for it. And then she goes on to say, these readers can read the invisible writing on the text. That's a good description of what I'm describing here, to read the invisible writing. Because you can say anything if you just become like the 60s people. I became a tenure-track assistant professor in the fall of 1965. So to an extent, I really have an experience of this. These 60s people, to me, it's not relevant to me. Me. To me, the Virginia Woolf reads like this, okay, etc., etc. So what do I care? That's not what we are talking about. And close reading is not what we're talking about. That's kind of, you know, pushing the writer through a kind of cross-examination and bringing out the real meaning, which you know, symptomatic reading, close reading, etc. No, this is a kind of surrender kind of reading. And you do it, and you can't do everything like this. But this is what activist reading is like, imaginative activism, so that you take it like a relay and you move. So I've tried to do some of that, and keeping with Du Bois and class struggle in France. And I've tried to say that Du Bois's cooperative is where I'll find a toehold and grasp Bernard's hand, because I really do think, because he knows much more about cooperation than I do, since I haven't really, but his book will teach me, and I really do think that that is something that we also ought to somehow earned the right to break into Kwanzaa a little bit, because the first day it is, and Kenyatta did try it, the cooperative stuff. And so we should actually go there and see what the problems were. We can't just dance. So it just seems to me that that's where the relay from Du Bois goes. And we must also think about Sudan differently, it seems to me. Is that an ending?
That is. Thank you. Thank you, Gayatri. So you have given us so much to work with and to think about. And I'm going to try and pull some of these threads to ask a question, maybe so that I understand better the kind of reading that you're proposing for us of Marx and of Du Bois. First of all, I should say, though, with regard to cooperation and cooperative universities, we had a remarkable conversation about cooperative universities last year that I need to bring you in on with Kali Akuno. It was the last segment of last year's 13, where we were really trying to brainstorm the idea of a cooperative university. And I think the events since then have only made it more important for us to be thinking about that. A multi-stakeholder cooperative university where the stakeholders are students and faculty, but also community members, the people who work at the university, the staff, etc. So that's something I'm hoping that we can continue a separate conversation on. So transformations seem to be very important in the kind of readings that you're suggesting. And I heard a lot about the way in which Du Bois is reading Marx and the way in which that is transforming his own thinking and writing. Particularly the example that you gave of Du Bois using caste to racialize class, so the way in which he was trying to transform the notion of, well, to address the question of race through a Marxian concept of class, but then also to transform it by bringing in caste. And so I take it that that's the kind of model of transformative thinking that you valorize most and are encouraging us in a way to engage in as we read Du Bois and as we read Marx. So the ways in which we can use the work to transform the concepts that are most important to us to have a praxis effect. That's what I heard as being really important. There are, of course, a lot of other transformations that are taking place here. Many of them have to do with historical transformations, right? And so, for instance, you were talking about the transformation of Marx's relationship to the vote. There are also transformations of his relationship to the rural populations, or what he speaks of as the peasants. In terms of the vote, these are changes that are taking place. These are changes that are taking place because of the different historical conjunctures, I take it. You were mentioning in the introduction, and there's the passage on page 21 of Engels's introduction to class struggles in France, where he really makes it clear that, these are different times. He's writing in 1895, right? These are different times. They require a different analysis. They require different strategies. You have that paragraph, the last full paragraph on page 21. For here, too, the conditions of the struggle had essentially changed. Rebellion in the old style, the street fight with barricades, which up to 1848 gave everywhere the final decision, was to a considerable extent obsolete, right? So there are historical transformations from experiences of defeat, that mean that we need to be looking at different models, different strategic models, political models. The vote becomes more important, universal. Of course, it's male suffrage. There's a silent male in all of this writing, which then, of course, plays that important role in the footnote on page 381 that you were referring to in Black Reconstruction in America, right? It's not just the vote, so, and it's not just the vote, it's actually voting the right way, voting consciously to rid themselves of the domination of private capital, right? So those are all transformations which are taking place because of historical experience and historical change. But that's not, I take it that's not really, I mean, it's important, but that's not the transformation that you're interested in terms of reading, in terms of what you were referring to as the humanities way of reading. It's something about reading in combination to transform the way we think about concepts. And we had the example from Du Bois.
Can I just catch you for a moment?
Yeah, please. Yes,
you're quite right. But, what I say, I'm going to give that talk on the 31st and on the globalized global university. See, I have a concept which I have found from these people, really, it's not my own, of event and task. So, like, we are already global, whether we like it or not. So that's the event, the events that you're talking about. Historically, this happened and that happened. But within that event, we have a task to change it in order to, let's say, for Marx to bring about the dictatorship of the proletariat, for Du Bois to make a world where all human beings were equal, etc., etc. So we have a task, and small tasks also. So that's how, this is from Hegel's articulation that there may be a tendency, but you have to take that tendency and bring it to crisis in order for the change to take place. One of the best examples is the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. Because, people were saying to Bertel Ollman, hey, and he had invited me as a bad postmodernist, so I didn't tell, and I didn't give the answer. He had forgotten the answer. So we said, our rate of profit doesn't fall, we make windfall profits. So why does Marx say there's a tendency of the rate of profit to fall? Because you have to, if you don't grab that tendency, the event, and make it into a crisis, the task, then the capitalist is going to manage the crisis and have a windfall profit. So this is the thing that we have to remember. See, the transformation business. The idea, it's a Hegelian idea, the problem, the event and task. Something happens, and then you do something about it, knowing and doing. Or not even knowing, so. Well, no, because they are both a theoretical practice. They're both theoretical practice. Both the event in which you are You are making theory as a superpower guy. And I am making theory as an upper caste elite metropolitan in the superpower. So that is a theoretical practice. That's not just theory. And so we have to, both are changeful. We have to, it's a rearrangement. That Marx and Engels talk a lot about that, Marx more. It's a rearrangement of desires. What do I want? See, so it's not like a kind opposition. It's a degree opposition. Yes, it's a degree opposition. And it's more than a degree opposition, it's a displacement opposition. See what I mean? Sorry, took it away from you. But I just felt that if I brought this in, it would be easier.
Right. Okay. Yeah, definitely. So, and in trying to figure out what kind of displacements or transformations would be most useful today, I take it that one of the reasons to read Du Bois in relationship to class struggles in France is kind of being here in the United States, that the analysis, I mean, the analysis in class struggles in France is slightly too European historical in terms of who the actors are, who the agents are, and bringing a very similar kind of approach of class struggles to the American context and to the context of the history of race in America and slavery in America, then allows us to modify or to transform the concepts, Marx's concepts, in the most useful way, right? So it's no longer the question of the French peasantry, which dominated the political scene in France at the time, at least on Marx's reading, yes, right? We're dealing with a different situation. We're dealing with the afterlives of slavery, and race, class, and caste, etc. So, is there a way then to update this? So, is there a way then to how should it help us? How can it help us understand the present and transform our concepts today, or some of the concepts that are in here? So one of the things you talk a lot about right now, maybe it's just because I'm with you, is questions of cooperation, which are somewhat, I view them being introduced here as more kind of strategic, but maybe not, maybe political. Is there something about cooperation or something else that represents a kind of transformation that we could see from class struggles to Black Reconstruction in America, but then to help us today with our present? And obviously today, I mean, it's a little bit difficult to talk about today given what's happened this week. But yeah.
No, see, because class struggle, after all, is about, I think it's best to put it, because otherwise I can't do anything with the book. Class struggle is about and 18 Brumaire is about the increase in executive power. Isn't that what we are looking at today? Yeah, and you see, I put some, just for fun, well, fun is hardly the word. I mean, look at page, I think, what have I written here? Is this 52?
Which one, this one?
This one.
That looks either like a 62 or
Okay.
82.
60. See, I wrote a patch. 62. 62. Yes. See, 62. For the entire duration of its rule, as long as it played the principal and state role on the proscenium, an unbroken sacrificial feast went on in the background. The continual sentencing by courts-martial of the imprisoned June insurgents or their deportation without trial. The Constituent Assembly had the tact to admit that in the insurgents of June, it was not judging criminals but wiping out enemies. So what? Okay, and I want to read another one.
That's a great
Quickly,
passage.
quickly.
That kind of, that is the
There's
contemporary
71.
counter-revolution.
Yeah, go to 71. I'm talking about Trump.
Yeah, no, I know. He just said that they're going to be revamping Guantanamo Bay and putting 30,000 persons there this afternoon. That was the latest.
See, and that is why, so we can draw, that is why, on page 71, when the proletariat is doing something, you see, no more taxes, down with the rich, down with the republic, long live the emperor. No more taxes, down with the rich, down with the contradictions here are very much like the people who voted for him. No more taxes, down with the rich, down with the republic, long live the emperor. Behind the emperor was hidden the peasant war. The republic that they voted down was the republic of the rich. But, you see this mistake in the electorate. And then, for example, 121 and 122, and I won't give you any more. There are many, many more. 121 and 122. What were all these laws and measures? Desperate attempts to reconquer the departments and the peasants of the departments for the party of order. So there is the law against the school teachers, by which they, the men of talent, the spokesmen, the educators and interpreters of the peasant class, were subjected to the arbitrary power of the prefect. They, the proletarians of the learned class, ourselves, proletarians of the learned, were chased like hunted beasts from one commune to another. The proposed law against the mayors and the presidents of the peasant communes were every moment confronted by the president of the republic and the party of order. The ordinance which transformed the 17 military divisions of France into 4 pashaliks and forced the education law by which the party of order proclaimed the ignorance and the forcible stupefaction of France as the condition of its own life under the regime of universal suffrage. Look at this. Could be a description of our society. You know, so it seems to me we can take a look here at this incredible increase in the power of the executive. That's what these two pieces are about. What happened with these revolutions, you know, and to an extent what we are looking at is the failure of the French Revolution, which did give us human rights, which did give us the, you know, basically idea of citizenship. That's the French Revolution that has lasted for us, and we are still living there, and it's good. But basically it also failed, and this is the story of its failure. And why did it fail? Because as democracy is failing here, it's the rise in executive power. So that's really the story of these two things. So I will say that it can, we can look at it that way.
Although we would need to analyze differently kind of the forces in society, I take it, because in this story, Class Struggles in France, I think, again, the rural populations play such a big role, and their vote plays such a big role, and I'm not sure that we would, I'm not sure how that category gets rethought in the United States today.
Agribusiness is primitive accumulation, right? The transformation of land into capital And that's the historical change that has happened. But the whole, so that we don't look at it in terms of farmers, you know, I mean, because obviously it's not the same. I'm not saying it's the same. But in terms of land grabbing, in terms of, and you know, here we have to think about the indigenous folks a little bit differently from the way we think of ourselves, you know, and that today the real problem is that that land grabbing has to be thought of differently. That has nothing to do with this horrors of Trumpism or everything, because we cannot think of, we have to develop a mindset which realizes that the world is everyone's home. You know, it's, I'm not being romantic. I mean, I say to the very poor tribals in my schools who have never seen rivers, never seen any water. They haven't seen oceans. They have not been anywhere except that little village, nowhere. So I say that you do this and a change happens. And so I had, I don't have it here, but you actually may have it, Diva, no? Are you here? The picture of that Namibia. Diva left, okay. See, the picture of, with Bengali subtitles, the picture of how, so that they can see how in Namibia very, very ordinary women are really transforming the rainlessness, etc. So that way of thinking, that it's not just about undoing primitive accumulation in land grabbing. And here Marx says primitive accumulation is the, whatchamacallit, you know, the debt, national debt, national debt. Taxes are not good for finance aristocracy, but national debt is wonderful for finance aristocracy because they are, and it's absolutely true here, you know, the rate of interest falling and rising, because they're playing dishonestly with the money that we are supposedly investing. So to an extent, that's not the whole story today, because we have to even think of this. This is a real rearrangement of desire. God knows how that can be done. The idea that that ownership is fiction. You cannot own land. Common sense tells us that you cannot own land. But the world is everyone's home, even if you're in prison, even if you're lying as a homeless person on the pavement, no one can throw you away from the world. And so this business of thinking differently, it's that we are all responsible. This is so different from what is happening with the rise in executive power and the use of capital because the use of capital in the old-fashioned way no longer will give you the wonderful life. The pursuit of happiness as pursuit of capital will not work anymore because it's capital that's killing you. So it's come to that. So that there, I think we have to talk very differently. We have to, the relay goes way off. But there are moments in both in Marx and in, I don't particularly like the ethnological manuscripts or whatever they're called, ecological manuscripts. They're forcing him to say things that he can't really say. But there are places in Marx when he's talking about primitive accumulation. He says that the American Indians will not be tempted by primitive accumulation. One sentence. Because he loved the Algonquins, right? So you can go through there. Or you can go, and in Du Bois also there are places where this idea of another world, which you find in these novels, you know, a world of borderlessness. That's way off, but we have to think about it.
Right. So let me see. I mean, we're how we're doing on time, and also who wants to jump in and kind of continue the conversation and maybe ask some questions. Daniel Kessler, you want to start, and then I'll pass it to you. You want to turn on your...
Yeah. Du Bois talks about the wages of whiteness and talks about a psychological versus a material kind of identity, although he doesn't make clear what's the mediation between psychological and the material. And I think there's an indeterminacy in Du Bois that's also present in class struggles in France about what form identification takes in political action versus material interests. And I think that's a problem that's very much with us today. And Craig Wilder talks about in 1809 in New York City, there are black longshoremen and Irish guys who are out of work are given baseball bats when the black longshoremen go on strike to take the peers away from them. That this idea of racial division being a way of creating class fraction through race and ethnic identification, and the displacement of economic frustration onto othering is absolutely with us today. And I think Du Bois shows that materiality is not enough to explain political behavior, because the wages of whiteness makes it such that people act against their class interest, a very problem that we have today.
Yes, the
So what are your thoughts about that?
racialization of class makes you act against your class interests. That's why caste is brought in. You see, class is almost not recognized. But Du Bois, where did you see the wages of whiteness? From what text are you citing?
Oh, in Reconstruction, he talks
Okay.
about the wages of whiteness.
But you know where he really talks about it is in his biography of John Brown, because he's a pacifist, but he has to come to terms with violence, because he thinks of John Brown as an African American. And therefore he says the wages of whiteness and the cost of liberation, because wages is price, that is unreal, and cost is real, and so that's how he comes to terms with violence in his thing of, and so therefore your idea of the Irish, that's just one example. This stuff between immigrants and black folk, I mean, this is like a whole long story of violence, right? So it really comes, I think it's very apposite. You're quite right.
But and Du Bois, I think, also is making an argument that violence precedes the Civil War, that violence and struggle against violence, like again in the New York example, there's a slave revolt, interestingly, in New York, where black people and Irish people who are not thought of as white act in alliance. And so I think there's some way that we think about the struggle beginning, and Du Bois is also clear in Black Reconstruction, that that's not the beginning of struggle, that there's struggle all the
No, of course not. In fact, that black picture that you wanted very much to show, those are pages from this. These are pages from the World and Africa, which I made into this. Okay, he gives all the dates. I just made it like this because I wanted people to realize just what you're saying, that the connection here, long before the Civil War, the connection here is what much later, because this is in the 1850s, now even a little earlier, and much later in the late 70s, the Loz and Guattari called rhizomatic, right? The connections are rhizomatic under the underground, and you have to be aware of them. Why? Because violence, the story of violence, did not begin with the Civil War. You're absolutely correct. And people don't realize that they say Du Bois is going away from race. when he's global. This is global. See, this is just my diagrammatization of something that's in the world and Africa. You know, these are rhizomes.
Thank you. Yes, Abba, could you pass the mic right behind you? And turn it on by flicking the thing on the side up.
Thank you so much for your lecture. I'm a teacher I teach art history at Hunter College.
Thanks.
My question is about reading, and I was wondering about, I mean, you probably already talked about it, but I was thinking about these soldiers that you described, and I was, of course, you talked about Du Bois's own reading, but what about them? What was their kind of literacy? Maybe some more background is there a kind of literacy for the subaltern? You know, and what does that actually amount to in practice, as well as in the intellectual scene that you're describing?
What a good question that is. You see, the thing is that he was surprised, as many people were, that they were able to access the principles of socialism so easily. You see, when the Freedmen's Bureau came into being, and they were able, with Captain or Colonel Howard, you know, the Howard College, the Howard University, people were amazed that they were able to go to those principles so easily. So to an extent, the moment of the coming of the Lord is not sustained. You know, they move. The coming of the Lord stuff, it's a very fine question. That subject of enslavement, that is a moment imagined by Du Bois, as you say. Du Bois is reading. But they also are expressed in the spirituals. I mean, I know that Zora Neale Hurston said that it was not all sorrowful, etc. That's the difference between Harlem and the South. Those didn't go away. In fact, when in 1872 the decree came in that they had to give away their land that they had gotten and pay the plantation owners, they all broke into the song, Such Times That We Have Known. They all broke into song, so that to an extent the idea of expressing the very principles of socialism, as it were, and then of course the music became, as it should have, through the Jubilee singers and so on, Fisk especially, it became wonderfully commercialized. It's fine, no problem. But so therefore, what did you say your name was?
I didn't say my name. My name is Saluvidi Moses. I'm
at Hunter College, yes. Okay, so I know you didn't say your name. That's a way of saying, will you please tell me your name? I'm an old-fashioned person. See, I learned English as a foreign language. I went to a Bengali medium school. And so I often use very old sort of British idioms made right for Oriental students. That's what you are. Okay. So anyway, so that's why I would say that it is, one should look at it as a moment of, and you see this business of generalizing class, generalizing caste. Once you came into the phenomenological way of thinking, what Sartre would call later, existentialism is not exactly the great phenomenologists, but Sartre had a nice word, situation, Simone de Beauvoir as well as Sartre, that each thing was in a situation, and the situation was, or what we would normally call, I suppose, context. But you had to imagine that, so that it undoes the total summarizing. So therefore, do that with the Du Bois thing. He's certainly not suggesting, and you really, by asking the question, you allowed me to make it clear. He certainly is not suggesting that they're just stuck there. And as to what did they say, there's a lot of the Freedmen's Bureau is over-archived. You can see what they said. It's fantastic. So.
Thank you, and thank you for the question. Anyone else want to jump in? Razan?
I don't have a question, but I'm going to take the relay and ask for a comment. But one of Du Bois's very interesting students was a woman named Charlotte McCleskey. She was the first black woman to come to the States to get a bachelor degree, and she studied with Du Bois at Wilberforce. And she had, in fact, become interested in the possibility she could move first to Britain and then to the US after having encountered the McAdoo singers in Kimberley in South Africa. And she's very well known as a social worker, a missionary, and was accused by some very do-gooder feminists of being a very conservative force for women. But in fact, when she went back, she became very involved in the leadership of women's protests against passes, and she led a movement against white women's suffrage. And on the grounds that white women, if they got the vote, would continue to vote against black women's interests. But her most interesting, I think, contribution to the debates there, she never cited Du Bois. She was an activist and very important in the South African Christian Zionist Church. But her most interesting argument, which you have spoken about, was to encourage people not to accept the temptation of an exception from past laws. And she made the argument on, in very enormous public spaces that to accept an exception from the law would constitute an acquiescence to the logic of the past, that was itself a past. And I think that gesture was something she learned from Du Bois, that bringing to crisis a kind of general discourse of universal right by thinking this mechanism by which people would be mobilized against class and mobilized within that racial system. So the only invitation, really, the only mechanism for black people at that time to be able to move in public spaces freely and so forth was to get a pass that was an exception to the past law. And you have spoken elsewhere about this question of the exception, which is, it seems to me, one of the major mechanisms of our moment to mitigate what might be other kinds of collective solidarity projects. The invitation into power as an exception from one's possible class is everywhere, and in universities as well. So I'm just going to pass that back to you as part of the reading.
You know, I know of her, obviously, but I did not know about the South African stuff. So thank you for that, and maybe you will give me a reference so I can give you a footnote. But you are obviously totally right. This is one of our temptations. I'm sorry to use a moral word, but that's what you see. You know that I do the Marxist Feminist Congress, which is the only thing that I do with Europeans, because they really have shown that they want to figure how really wants, although she can't really do it, but I also can't do many of the things she can, so I'm not just faulting her. That they've got to decentralize is what I have said. You can't just give theses from Germany, etc. But when we have these congresses, when you come to the Americans, there is such individuation and self-praise, and you know, I mean, it's amazing. It's all touchy-feely. First of all, you forget all class discourse, and in everything that they have put their hands on, they've succeeded. It's as if they're writing a grant proposal for corporate funding when they speak of, maybe that's what they read, I don't know. It's really quite amazing, and it seems to me that that's something that we must forget. It's very hard to forget it, Roz, you know, I mean, one way of, you made a university professor, you're singular. This is a joke. I'm the same thing. It's we're kicking upstairs. I'm the same thing that I was the day before Lee Bollinger wrote that letter. So one has to fight against that kind of exceptionalization. And I think if you can show me that, that's what, sorry, if you can show me that's what she's doing, then it will be a wonderful thing to learn from, that she learned. I think, indeed, Du Bois probably learned it from Du Bois probably learned it from, I mean, she probably learned it from Du Bois. Charlotte was her name, no? Yes, Charlotte, yes. So that's, I would say, yes. But you've got to give me stuff. Okay.
I think we have time for one more question, and then maybe we can wrap it up with some final thoughts. So, yes. Awa, can you pass the mic back? Thank you.
Thank you. Earlier you mentioned how subalterns earn or have earned their humanity by becoming soldiers or demonstrating violence in certain scenarios. You pointed to the example, I believe, from Ukraine. Would you be willing to share your thoughts on, you know, the participation of Indian soldiers in World War II and the Sikh community, and kind of tie that to the same example? Would you not view that under the same light?
Yes, it's again a very powerful question. You must have realized that I was profoundly ironic, as was Du Bois, if that's the only way to, you know, I'm so much a pacifist that I believe all killing is bad. I don't have any idea of just war or anything. I think war is the most idiotic thing in the world. It's to think that you win anything by killing a larger number of people and then negotiating. I mean, I think that's a joke. But so I was very ironic, and so was Du Bois, that the only way for these contraband folks, he wouldn't call them fugitive slaves, and so it was to kill and be killed for the Union. But yes, in the sense of Indians fighting in the Second World War, in the Second World War, also the First, the fighting, within the army, there was, you know, India is a huge place. Within the army, there was a certain kind of acceptance. Whereas the Civil War was really not like that, because the Northern Army moved into the South, okay? I'll give you Ambedkar's example. Ambedkar was from everybody here knows who Ambedkar was, right? I mean, that's available. Okay, Ambedkar was from an army family, right? So he had, in fact, not experienced. It was like Fanon. Fanon had not experienced. Fanon, when he was first fighting in Algeria, he was fighting for de Gaulle. You know, he was fighting for the Free French. So when he went to shake de Gaulle's hand, de Gaulle said, "Ah, vous, le nègre, passez." And so he said, I thought I was a gentleman of the French Empire. No, I'm an N-word. And so, in a sense, that's what happened to Ambedkar. You know, inside the army conclave, there was a whole situation where there was certainly, and his dad was not exactly low. I forget what his, perhaps someone else will know what his rank was. But then when he went to school, he saw that he couldn't drink water from the caste Hindus' water source. So therefore, it wasn't a full acceptance. When you were within the army enclave, you were certainly in a different place. But once you came out into the world, everything more, unless you, but there were no Indians who were, in fact, generals at that point, no. I think second lieutenant was about as high as they could go. So.
Thank you. So maybe we can end with some final thoughts of yours that extend some of the ideas that you were presenting tonight. I was struck when you were when you were distinguishing yourself from a close reading, right? You were setting aside kind of close reading as not what we're doing here. And so I just wanted to maybe end on that question. So it really is extraordinary to read these two texts in conversation because of just the richness of the parallels and differences, but I mean close parallels between the way in which kind of Marx describes the proletariat coming into existence as an agent in history here, and the way that Du Bois is discussing the way that the formerly enslaved person is and class is coming to existence as a force of the motor of history, with obviously differences, the importance of failure in both of them, although different failures, and that was something that was so important in what you were talking about, learning from failures. Obviously in class struggle, it's the failure of the June days and of the February days for the proletariat. In Du Bois, it's the failure of reconstruction in a way, right? I mean, it's not actually, it's all, you know, so for Marx, it's the failure of the revolution that gives rise to the proletariat as a self-conscious force, a revolutionary force. In Du Bois, it's not really the failure of the Civil War. I mean, there are successes that create a sense of agency, but there are later the failures, of course, of the end of Reconstruction, understood as a mode of a counter-revolution built on property, right? And of course, those are ideas that a counter-revolution built on property is what you're getting as well in the class struggles, right? So there are all of these ways in which the two works are talking to each other. And so what is this idea of not focusing on the close reading, right? But somehow understanding or somehow focusing on how these two works are in conversation, are feeding each other, and then how do we perform that into the next text, which I take it is the present or something like that, right? Yeah. So some final thoughts on that, maybe.
Well, you know, it's not like we can't feel the two texts talking to each other. It's just how shall I put it? Since as far as I'm concerned, the humanities are for bringing about change, about rearranging desires. We would do it only by surrendering our limited, class-determined, caste-determined, finance-determined, politics-determined, military-industrial determined, race-determined selves by opening them up into something else. We are looking at the same thing. We are looking at these two texts talking to each other, but we are not looking at it by making them objects of cross-examination. It's a hard thing to do, to read in that way. That is to say, surrendering oneself to the text as if you wrote it. I mean, when in the 60s of the last century, there was the idea of the death of the author. It was the death of the author is the birth of the reader as writer. So to an extent, the responsibility of reading became much heavier. And I'm influenced by Gramsci here, not so much influenced, but I kind of go by, because really the first training into this was in Calcutta, Taraknath Sen, and I have a long essay which I haven't yet published on how it was that, and Sukumari Bhattaji also, two of them, but that's why I could so easily insert myself into Diman, who was also very much like this, so that what you start doing, Akbar Abbas gave me the phrase, he said, when I was talking in Taiwan, I was in the audience, and he stood up right in the middle of my talk, and he says, when we were, Akbar is just a year or two older than I am, that when we were young, the writing had to have critical distance. My, as little as possible, critical distance is what you must achieve. But you are bringing into being something that I will call critical intimacy. And I have really, that was a wonderful gift, like Rose's gift right here. But, and I've run with that one. So it seems to me, it's really not, when Gramsci writes, commenting on, commentary on critique of Hegel's, Hegel's what? Which one? Critique of rights, exactly. He says that when Marx, what Marx is writing, that when Marx was writing that, what he made us understand was that his project was not psychological or moral. It's fine that he doesn't use the word political, psychological or moral, but epistemological. And in fact, in Italian, he uses the word gnosiological, which is even more interesting, gnosis. But it was epistemological. And in other words, if one looks at Capital One, and one reads Capital One not like the immensely learned David Harvey, who knows much more about Marx than I could ever hope to know, but David Harvey's reading is to tell you, this is what Marx is, this is what Marx is, so that you know Marx. Mine is, on the other hand, when you're looking at Capital Volume 1, you see that if you can somehow insert yourself into that area of factory work of the most abject sort. I saw a little bit of it in Bangladesh, but anyway, if you can, then you see that what Marx is telling the working class was change yourself by imaginative activism, epistemological performance, and see that you're not the victim of capital, but the agent of production. Then alone can we confront capital. So it's not as if one is not trying to see the truth of the text. But what is the truth claim? You know, we read everything as if it's underived fiction, because everything ultimately is unverifiable. So since in the humanities we are trained to learn from the singular and the unverifiable, which is very hard, that's the skill that we bring. So that, I mean, you cannot succeed in displacing yourself into that time in France. You know, I always think when I hear Engels, who was very different from Marx, Engels writing that the street fighting is gone because the other side, capital, has very developed weaponry, etc., etc. I think of Che Guevara. How did they redo guerrilla warfare? They rethought it. How did they do it? Because Althusser, God love him, Althusser told them, I mean, what have we done with structuralism? Very little. But Althusser, by being a structuralist, pointed out to them that you didn't have to follow the party line, which was the narratives of the mode of production. So you could, in fact, begin wherever you are. And then the huge enthusiasm about developing urban guerrilla warfare, which, of course, unfortunately, the Palestinians are getting horrible punishment because because the Israelis are just doing the one thing you can do to completely ignore the fact that urban guerrilla warfare has to take cover behind the normality of the urbis. But so, to an extent, that's that kind of thing, you know, where you actually change yourself, displace yourself into the arena and develop a way of reading which is coming perhaps from there. I mean, you don't succeed. I'm not saying that's the only way to read. I mean, we certainly do also need summaries and knowledge production, but it seems to me that if one thinks about humanities beyond the disciplines, then the humanities can provide something by undermining the vanity of the intellectual who assumes that just by producing a reading, he or she has already been an activist. You know, people will say, my pedagogy is my activism. Or use the word praxis. When I ask, well, how is it distinguished from practice for you? They can't say too much of anything. I mean, and why go into that old Greek contrast, technique, praxis, etc. So theorein. And especially since if one looks at theorein, in that theorein technique praxis combo, theorein is not really theorize as we know it. It's kind of making visible, isn't it? So to an extent, it's not that we are not reading as carefully as possible, trying to read as if the text is talking. But it's a very strange feeling. If it's possible to move from knowing to learning, there comes the moment when the text, the dead thing, seems to be a subject. But then that's the kind of crazy stuff that the humanities encourage, because, you know, we don't have to exist. You know, the imagination is neither rational nor irrational. The world can do very well without us. So, what can they? That's the question. So that's why I would say, no, of course we should be as careful, as responsible as possible. But the real move is with the cooking of my soul rather than finding his meaning. So that's what I would say. It sounds very romantic, but believe me, once you sit down to read, it isn't that romantic. It's hard to do. But in my classroom, I try to read with my students in this way. I don't know what they get out of it, but some of them are happy about it. In fact, you know, Tangam Ravindranathan, do you know her name? If you don't, you folks should know her name. She's a professor at Brown, and she's really wonderful. She is doing climatological readings, right? And so she reads, what you may call it, Robdier's Bananas, Robdier's La Jalousie, as a story actually about bananas, you know, because it's fantastic. And and she calls it metabolic reading. Okay, it's a long piece. And I am so pleased she closes with a quote from me, which is exactly what I'm driveling on about. You know, she says that, you know, you don't excuse, you don't say art can heal. Marx was revolutionary. You don't accuse. Marx knew nothing about feminism. Marx was a racist. Marx was Eurocentric. And of course, about Du Bois, many bad things have been said. But you don't accuse. You try to get in as much as possible into the text, and from within then, loving the text as it were, you find a toehold so that you can turn it away from what seems to be its original self-representation. She quotes this damn thing as the last sentence of her wonderful piece on La Jalousie as a book about bananas. But I ask everyone to look out for it. I don't know where she'll print it, but it is the first kind of thing that I have seen that really does give to Amitav Ghosh's idea that the novel, the tradition of the novel, tradition of literary writing cannot accommodate the Anthropocene. It's a real response to him. So it's worth reading. It's not like just writing about how wonderful the earth is. It's a good reading. So that's why I would say that this stuff does help some people. Not everyone, but it does help some people. Is that okay?
Perfect, perfect. Okay. All right, thank you so much, Gayatri. Thank you for being so generous with your time and your thoughts, and teaching us how to read. So I think we'll close now. Thank you so much, Ricardo, for all the work organizing this. Thank you, Reno, for all your help with the AV. Thank you to all the folks who had to move into the overflow room for your patience with our fire marshals. And for those of you who'd like to join us, we'll meet across at Arts and Crafts at the pub for a drink and continue to talk about reading Marx and Du Bois. Thank you so much.